Well, thank you, Bill, and thank you for that kind introduction. And everyone can hear me clearly. I have a kind of excellent. Well, welcome. I know this is already the second day and evening of your visit here to Marist College, but can never say welcome too many times. And I hope the conference has been going well. I've heard very good things about it. I heard you had an excellent, one of my favorite speakers this afternoon, beamed in briefly, Father Guido Sarducci. I'm sorry I missed that, but hopefully I'll have an opportunity to catch him at some point. Now, and welcome, of course, not just to Marist, but what we're going to hear a little bit about tonight is this historic Hudson River Valley, this very scenic region. It obviously is. All you have to do is kind of look out really from almost any spot on this campus, but certainly from even the windows here. I'm much more comfortable moving around. And when Bill and I were speaking a few weeks ago, when he had no spot in his program, and I pleaded with him for an opportunity to get onto the program, don't stand between me and a microphone. The idea was that very often conferences are held, and you come to a different city, a new place, and you're in the conference most of the time, but you don't really learn that much. Different part of the country, perhaps, different part of the state for many of you. But you don't necessarily learn that much about the place that you visit or the region that you visit. And that was part of what this little informal session, half hour or so, will be. It's really just to talk about what is a very unique culture, a very unique region, this Hudson River Valley. This region is a National Heritage Area. It was one of the first, in fact, it was the first recognized National Heritage Area back in 1996 when the idea of heritage areas were introduced. There were 11 of them introduced at one time by then President Bill Clinton, the Congress, and this region, the Hudson River Valley, was recognized as one of those 11. In fact, the legislation introducing the Hudson Valley was, the legislation was called the Landscape That Defined America. Now, some of the other regions, now there's about 30 or so of these heritage areas. Most of the heritage areas are the Gettysburg Battlefield, Antietam Battlefield, the industrial corridor, the New England industrial corridor between Lynn and Lowell, Massachusetts. They tend to focus around a single event, a big battle or something along those lines. The Hudson River Valley is different, though, in terms of the recognition by Congress. It was recognized for what Congress referred to as its significant and ongoing contributions to American history and culture. Yes, it has had some big battles, and that's been an important part of it, but there are many other aspects of this region's culture and history which had it stand out and which it was so recognized. And really right from the very beginning, even kind of in the description that you have in the little brochure about my talk, it was very different from most of the other regions settled in North America. In the 17th century, back in 1609, when Henry Hudson, of course, just had the 400th anniversary of that a couple of years ago, sailed up this river. This was the only place in North America settled by, in what became the United States, settled by a non-English speaking peoples, the Dutch. The Dutch are the ones that settled, of course, what was then New Netherland, New Amsterdam, which became New York City. And it was settled in a very different way from the rest of North America. Massachusetts and the Puritans settled in that area, and maybe some of you are from that. The New England region, of course, that's a much more famous in terms of its early history. The Chesapeake, Virginia, settled the first of the settled areas, also perhaps very famous, but they were settled in a certain way. Most of the folks who came to New England or to Virginia, very often they came as entire families. They came as entire villages. In fact, many of the towns and villages settled in New England in the 17th century, Dedham or Newton or Cambridge and these other places, Andover. In fact, they had the same names as the towns they had left in England. The whole town came over, and they brought their minister with them, and there was the same people that had left on the other side of the ocean just a few weeks before. Virginia, the same. Most of the other colonies, very similar to that. The Hudson River Valley and what became New York was very different. Again, not only was it originally settled by the Dutch, and it was a Dutch colony right through the 1670s, so 100 years shy of the Revolution, unlike the rest of the North America, the 13 colonies, the other 12 colonies. It was, again, Dutch, and they spoke Dutch. This region was, right from the start, America's first melting pot. The Dutch were first, but within just a generation, a few years after that, the English also began to settle in the Hudson River Valley. By the 1660s, The French also were settling here, French Huguenots. They settled right across the river, in fact, New Paltz, New Rochelle, other towns as well, where French was spoken. Dutch was, again, the primary language through the 1670s. Actually, 100 years later than that, at the time of the American Revolution, many of the towns in the Hudson Valley, their court records were still kept in Dutch because the primary language spoken was Dutch. But also other populations that lived in this region as well. German Palatines, which came to this area in the 1670s, 1680s. African-American slaves. Slavery was actually a very important component, a very big component of Hudson Valley society in the 17th and 18th century. Tend to think of that as a southern institution. It was not only that. And also Native Americans that lived here right through the early to mid 18th century before they were pushed westward. Now, I have a little a story on that as well. So from the very beginning, the Hudson Valley was different. There were many different types of peoples living within very close proximity to each other, living in villages near each other, and from a very early time, in the 17th century, in fact, they began to intermarry. There was trading, commerce among the different towns and villages, so there was a much greater sense of tolerance of difference in New York in the 17th and 18th century than there was in many of the other colonies of North America, where tolerance was not always put as a high premium. And so there was also much greater understanding, which perhaps explains why New York developed the way that it did over the course of the 18th and into the 19th centuries, becoming a far more cosmopolitan, complex society than did much of the other parts of North America. So from the very beginning, it was different. Now, in addition to that, one of the reasons that this region has been recognized as a heritage area was that it had a very central role in the American Revolution. Right? George Washington spent more than a third of the American Revolutionary War. The war began in 1775, ended in 1783. More than a third of the war in and around the Hudson River Valley, right from the start. The reason he was here and why the forces were here and why many battles took place here. In fact, the turning point of the Revolution, one of the most important battles in American history, was Battle of Saratoga, which is in the northern Hudson Valley, of course. This is a New York organization, I believe, right? There's probably folks from north of Albany, Saratoga. No, it's Boston. Nothing. Where are you from? Valley Forge, Pennsylvania? Well, an important place as well, but not a national heritage area. But one day, but it has my vote, and one day it will be, I'm sure. In any case, the reasons that there was so much warfare and battles, why Washington was here in the Hudson Valley, was because the British were here as well. They were in New York City, but they didn't want New York City. New York City in the 18th century really was nothing. It was an overgrown port town. It was the third, fourth largest, smaller than Philadelphia, which was probably the most important city in North America at that time. So the British were in New York City because they wanted control of this river. They wanted control of this immense transportation system, this rich agricultural producing area, which they knew would fuel their war effort, but also would allow them to break the colonies in half, cut off New England from the rest of the mid-Atlantic, Pennsylvania, and the South. So from the very start, every year from 1776 on, the British took control of New York City, kept it for the whole war. Every year after that, in spring, which was battle season in the 18th century, the British would move up the river to try to take it. In 1777, of course, was the big battle of Saratoga. And of course, Saratoga was nothing in the 18th century either. It didn't become a resort until the 19th century. Of course, the race track and so forth in the 20th century, late 19th and 20th century. That just happened to be where the armies met. The British were coming down from Canada through the Adirondacks. Another British army was coming from the west. Another was coming up from New York City, upriver. And the final stopping point was Saratoga, which was a major American victory, which strangely enough, George Washington was, or not strangely enough, George Washington was not at Saratoga. George Washington actually was at very few of the winning battles in the American Revolution, but he was at the last one, which is all that mattered in terms of Yorktown, a very important component. But in any case, so year after year, the British were always moving up this river. They burned Kingston, which was the first capital of New York. Kingston, just about 12, 15 miles to our north on the other side of the river. The construction of the Battle of Stony Point, just about 20 miles or so to our south. the West Point, before it was the military academy, was a fort, Fortress West Point, which was built for the specific purpose, along with Fort Montgomery, Fort Constitution, of attempting to stop those continuous British invasions every year. And so one of the most important stories and famous stories that comes out of the Revolution comes from the Hudson Valley, of course, is Benedict Arnold. And Benedict Arnold, who was put in as commander of West Point, and was Washington's trusted friend, and of course he tried to sell out West Point. Major Andre captured Benedict Arnold going over to the British side, but again, it wasn't West Point, it was the river, which the British wanted, and by getting control of that fort, that would allow them that easy access up and down the river. So throughout the course of the war, and the last 2 years of the war, in fact, Washington and the Army is stationed just to our south, about 12 miles to our south, 14 miles, Newburgh, New Windsor, from 1781 through 1783. That's where Washington was, again, with his Continental Army to stop any future invasion. Throughout the 17th and 18th century, this region had a very central component, a very central role in early American history. Now, in the late 19th and early 20th century, and I'm going to get to these slides soon and shortly to kind of envision some of this region began to change. This was an agricultural region in the 17th, 18th, early 19th century. But during the 19th century, with the rise of the steamboat, the growth of New York City at that time, the building of the Erie Canal near the Mohawk River and west, connecting up to Lake Erie and then into what was the Midwest, you have this major transportation development in the 1820s. 1823 actually is when the canal is open, 25 it's finished, and suddenly this region, which had been an agricultural producer, can no longer compete. Overnight, this region lost its primary marketplace as the producer for New York City. As the Midwest came in, and within the course of just a few days, you could now move your produce from this much richer, fertile land of the Midwest down to New York City. So this region transformed during the course of the 19th century, the 1830s, 1840s. Moved into some other agricultural pursuits. The tannery industry began to take off in the Catskills and other areas. And you start to see the beginnings of industrialization as well. And what you also start to see in the early 19th century, 1820s, 1830s, New York, the Hudson Valley, becomes America's first tourist destination. So as early as the 1820s and 1830s, you start to have this new emerging middle class out of New York City with this economic transformation taking place, the rise of white-collar workers and so forth. Time on their hands, somewhat more literate, educated, reading novels and having the opportunity to travel, Sunday off. Most people still worked a 6-day work week at that time. The new steamboats moving up the river and hotels that began to sprout up in the 1820s. In fact, again, West Point became a military academy at the turn of the century, turn of the late 18th to beginning of the 19th century. Its first real claim to fame, though, was it built the Thayer Hotel, which wasn't for any of the cadets, nor was it for the cadets' families, who were not welcome outside of September and May when they were dropping the kids off and they were taking them away. It was for tourists to come in and stay and look at the beautiful locale. And these are the types of things that they began to see and what began to emerge, and also things like the Catskill Mountain House, which in Catskill, just about 20 miles or so, 20, 25 miles to our north. What they began to, thank you, what began to fuel this market is the rise of what are America's truly unique contributions to American literature and American art. The Hudson River School of Writers, James Fenimore Cooper, Cullen Bryant, Washington Irving, and the Hudson River School of Art, the Hudson River Painters, Thomas Cole, Frederick Church, Asher Durand, and others. And from about 1825, not only the year the Erie Canal opened, also the year that Thomas Cole came to the United States. He's actually from England originally. You see the emergence of what becomes the most popular entertainment in the United States, the Hudson River landscape painting. And again, art historians today still will argue that this is America's most unique contribution in the area of art at any point. And these paintings were incredibly popular. Hundreds of these painters that went up and down the valley. And they were not just for museums. They had exhibitions at the New York Academy. And in the New York Academy, between the 1830 and about 1860, about 250,000 people each year attended one of these exhibitions. It was very cheap to do so. It was, again, a very popular form of entertainment. So, you know, it wasn't simply just a highbrow form of entertainment. There were many middle and working class peoples that were participating in this as well. And this is, well, High Park is just about 2 miles or so to our north, and this view, this is a Carnegie, Johann Carnegie, is from a point just about 2 miles or so to our north. Now, this is kind of a classic Hudson River School painting, kind of colorful, of the Hudson River landscape, mountains usually in the background, and usually the river. But the Hudson River School, by the way, is exactly that. They just didn't paint Hudson River things. They also painted, I'm not aware of any in Pennsylvania, but in Vermont and in the Adirondacks. And then it moved west when the Hudson Valley had kind of exhausted itself as a subject area for landscape painting. They moved to the Rockies, Albert Bierstadt and others. He was a Hudson River painter, and they began to paint those areas as well. Of course, this area made a lot of sense in terms of its closeness to the New York City market, again, for both tourists, for writers, and for painters. And also what they painted a lot of, this really isn't a landscape, this is Thomas Cole, who is probably, he's considered the preeminent Hudson River painter. Lived for about 20 years in Catskill, New York. Again, came from England. And New York Historical Society has his big Course of Empire and his Course of Life in the Proctor Museum and many other large paintings and large landscapes. And I have a couple of others. He also did, and many of these folks did, kind of historical landscapes as well. And in the 1820s, one of the most popular novels published in, I'm going to say 1824, I think it's 1824, is The Last of the Mohicans, James Fenimore Cooper's Last of the Mohicans, which is set in the Hudson River Valley. It's set just north of Albany. It takes a real event, the battle at Fort William Henry, and romanticizes it in a variety of different ways. In fact, Cooper wrote 5 of these novels in the 1820s and 1830s and the 1840s. And he wrote several others where he was the best-selling author of the 1820s and 1830s in the United States. The Spy, Satan's Toe, and other novels that he wrote. That's just not a good one. You know, it's a bad shot. It's a bad image. This is Asher Durand. He was much more of a pastoral painter, excellent painter. This just isn't, I don't know why I have that there, actually, now that I think about it. He did much better stuff, and he deserved better than have that image up there. This is actually, I would argue, even a more classic kind of Hudson River painting. And there's a couple of different things that emerge here. On the one hand, historians and art historians argue that, you know, what you see in the Hudson River School in the 1820s, 1830s is America coming to age, trying to develop an identity, a cultural identity, a national identity. And you can see this in the paintings themselves as they, you know, draw this sense of the immense expanse of what America could be with the mountains and the mix of colors and so forth. But again, using the Hudson Valley as their test case. This is John Kensett, and he's a little bit different from some of the more famous painters, because there is that top tier, and then there's this kind of second tier of Jasper Cropsey and John Kensett and Sanford Gifford. They tend to be more psychological in their paintings, a little bit more evocative, do some different things, both with space and color than some of the earlier ones, which I just had here. And the other thing which they did, too, very common in Hudson River paintings, is that this is probably in the, might be about 1860, but certainly into the 1850s that he painted this. What you don't see is what is already in the Hudson Valley by the 1850s, 1860s. Factories and the railroad and things like this. So it's a very romanticized vision as well. And part of the Hudson River School is this recognition that something is changing, and they see that change taking place. Thomas Cole, the lead painter, not only painted about this, but he wrote about this as well. He had an essay called The Ravages of the Axe, and his concern was kind of an early environmentalist, not as much in terms of like sustainability. I don't think they were as thoughtful on those things or didn't think about those things, but the landscape provided this kind of nourishment for the soul, and in this age which was industrializing, this was something which had to be protected. And so what some of these painters were attempting to do, they went back to an earlier time when that's not what they saw when they actually went out and painted. That's what they created. So it really was a creative vision in the 1920s. The 1820s, 1830s, 1840s. I'm going to say that this is down toward the Palisades, the Highlands, actually. So maybe near Cold Spring area. It's south, it's not north, it's not the Catskills. This is the Catskills, and this is Sanford Gifford. And in fact, Sanford Gifford is my favorite Hudson River painter. Very interesting in terms of his approach to things, certainly very different. He did, and just to give you a sense of the, Frederick Church, probably more famous, Olana, a beautiful home up the river. Gifford did the same shots, the same paintings, the same places in the Catskills 30 or 40 times, because he was less interested in what he saw out there objectively than what he was subjectively seeing in his own portrayal of what he saw. And so he did Catterskill Cove, he did Catterskill Falls, many, many times, always a little bit different. And what I have always felt about this, and Gifford has kind of seen, many of these painters were very spiritual. Thomas Cole thought that the whole role of painting and landscape painting was to bring one closer to some greater design, something out there in terms of that. Gifford is somewhat similar to that. I kind of think he's different, though. They were spiritual, but very different in their spirituality. And he's much more in line with kind of like the New England transcendentalism of the 19th century, Ralph Waldo Emerson, the idea of an oversoul, almost kind of a Buddhist kind of approach. And very often you see in his work some attempt also to connect one to something bigger, but not necessarily as in the same way that Cole and others did. Something a little bit more neutral in approach. But it just happens again to be my favorite. This is a Thomas Cole. It doesn't look like a very sunny morning on the Hudson there, but this is very classic of Cole, in which you have essentially two different paintings in one. You have two entirely different images. If you look up to the top there, it is a sunny morning on the Hudson. It's light, it's colorful, it's bucolic, kind of flexible, and then here, this would be from the Catskills, down in the bottom left, and he often kind of worked in these triangles. It's a much more evocative, startling sight of the trees, kind of bare there, dead, dying, in terms of that. And that's often a big part of Cole's work is that, well, his big thing was the four-thing course of life, is that it is a constant course of life, and you have to see all the goodness and the ugliness as part of the whole. Okay, so that's one of the major contributions of the Hudson Valley. And of course, the Hudson Valley literature, again, Washington Irving, Legend of Sleepy Hollow, Rip Van Winkle and so forth, German folk tales, which had been translated here. Actually, he and Cooper both not children's writers. Very often people think of Rip Van Winkle and Legend of Sleepy Hollow as children's stories. In fact, they can be read at that level, but they also were very big social commentaries as well. Washington Irving spoke a lot about the changes he saw in the market taking place, how the market was changing society, and how politics was changing in the 19th century as well. And also, these novels are very, these short stories, Washington Irving and Cooper both had a very strong sense of region. Had big problems with New Englanders generally. Saw New England culture as different and something that had to be kind of pushed back. And I'm just, no one be insulted here, I'm just telling you what Washington Irving and Fenimore Cooper were thinking back in the 19th century. And so in Washington Irving, like in The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, think about Ichabod Crane, he's an outsider, he comes from New England. He's described as avaricious, he's greedy, he's just kind of looking to get what he can from the good Dutch families that he is working with. In terms of the legend of, Rip Van Winkle, you see something similar. Rip Van Winkle's wife, who dies as part of the story, having a stroke after an argument with a New England peddler, and that's made very clear that that's who this peddler was. So, and you see that in Cooper's work too. And you see it in the painters too. The painters actually spoke about Yankee, and they meant New Englander at that time, Yankee entrepreneurialism, what they saw as a challenge to 18th century society, 18th and 19th century society. But anyway, just to move on, in the 19th century, the late 19th century, the Hudson Valley, one of its other major contributions was it became the area where America's elite began to build its summer homes. Actually, this was a real year-round home, the FDR home, but the Livingstons, the Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers, Mills, and others began to build their estates up and down the river. The Roosevelts, of course, did go back to the 17th century, and Roosevelt's home is just, that wasn't included in the conference in any way, was it? I can't remember. No, right. Oh, okay. But the FDR's home is 5 minutes to our north, 7 minutes, whoever went there. And again, this was a real lived-in home. This was the Roosevelt home. As, for example, the Vanderbilt estate, which is about 5 minutes further north than the FDR home, within 10 minutes of our camp, just about 10 minutes from campus, up on Route 9. Of course, what, there are 8 or 9 Vanderbilt estates. This is kind of the poor cousins of the Vanderbilt family. They lived here 6 weeks out of the year. Their home was in New York City. They would travel, of course, perhaps to the Breakers, to North Carolina. They would come up here for a couple of weeks at Christmas time to entertain. Other elites, they would never entertain the Roosevelts. They weren't up to the Vanderbilt's scale. And then they would come again perhaps in summer or early autumn. If you get a chance, and part of showing these places is, if you have an opportunity tomorrow, the conference ends tomorrow around noonish or so. If you have some time tomorrow or over the weekend if you're here, if you come back, these are some nice places to see. Actually, you can go to the FDR home, the Vanderbilt home, and the Eleanor Roosevelt Valkill home on one ticket. They're all three are National Park Service. I do not work for the National Park Service, but I will tell you it's a good deal. And there's a certain time frame that you would have to use that. The Vanderbilt home is a mansion, and it's a museum. It's not a home. It's very beautiful in its way, but again, it's very different from both the Roosevelt Place and the Mills Mansion, which is just another 10 minutes further north of the Vanderbilt home. So all you have to do is, in the course of 20 minutes, I'm going to say, just about, you would have these three major estates along the Hudson. The Mills Mansion was a mixture of two different families coming together. The old Livingston family from the 17th and 18th century, which had built a variety of estates. They had a manor, or the manorial estate, and they also were in the South as well. And the Mills family, railroad money, mining money, and which married together in the 19th century. This is their home. This is where they lived. And this is, at Christmas time in particular, they put on quite a production here, kind of a Victorian era Christmas. It's a beautiful place. It's a lived-in place. It's a museum as well, but very different from the other. Definitely worth the visit. It's a New York, that ticket will not get you into the Mills Mansion. It's a New York State site, also called the Statsburg estate. And this is Keiket, which is the Rockefeller home. And Rockefeller, of course, was born in the Hudson Valley. His family moved west he was born in Columbia County, moved west within the first few years of his life. And this is down in Westchester. A couple of other places, if you have the opportunity. A big part of, again, what I mentioned in the 19th century was the tourism, which took place. And in the second half of the 19th century, one of the major hotels that was built was the Mohonk Mountain House, which is in New Paltz. New Paltz is 15 minutes from here. The Mountain House is another 10 minutes. 20 minutes, 25 minutes from here is the Mohonk Mountain House. Obviously, beautiful views. That is Lake Mohonk and Sky Top to its right. And here's another angle of it. Built over time from the 1880s by the Smiley family, the Smiley brothers. Actually, they built two hotels. It was the Mohonk Mountain House and the Minnewaska Mountain House as well. Minnewaska never as successful as Mohonk. They were Quakers. There was no alcohol served. In fact, still today, alcohol. They built a bar. Well, okay. Well, you know, will nothing stay the same? They held out for a long time, I'll tell you that. For about 20 years ago, they did start to, you could order alcohol or wine or something at dinner and things, but they did not have the bar. And if you visit Mohonk, it's very beautiful. I mean, first of all, it goes on for, there's Mohonk Preserve around it, so the square mileage around it is huge. Around the winding roads are lots of signs, slowly and quietly. And people will be there to remind you to be both of those things if you, in fact, are to break that rule. In the 19th century, this was the place to go. 19th and 20th century. This, in fact, was my first job. My first job was at the Mohonk Mountain House. And so, fond memories. That is in fall, just to give you a sense. Those are the Catskills, southern Catskills behind it. This is, again, the Mohonk Mountain House is about 20 minutes due west, 25 minutes. About 55 minutes due north in Hudson, New York, is Olana. This is the home of Frederick Church, one of the painters I was showing before. He was, in fact, the most successful of the painters. Some of these painters many of them did not live in homes like this, built on the Hudson, overlooking the river. He specifically chose this site, specifically had this house built in a very Persian style, and more up-close version of it. This is also a New York State site, but definitely worth it. Amazing views. And just to give you a sense, anyone from the Hudson area, up there, you know? Are these people from New York? Are you sure? I've hit 3 regions that are pretty big. But in any case, if you ever get the opportunity to go there, it's certainly worth it. Just to give you a sense, though, back in 2000, and I'm going to lose the year here. It's the 18th century. I can give you the month. But in 2005, 2006, Governor Pataki was still the governor when they were going to build the St. Lawrence Cement Company was going to build right across the river from Olana. And there was a great deal. There was a PBS documentary about it. I don't know if people, it was on like 10 o'clock at night on PBS. Perhaps not many people saw it, but it was quite an issue up this way. And ultimately, and no one knew, the Army Corps of Engineers were involved. Can you build this thing? And if you drove around the roads, there were signs on people's front lawns, build the plant, stop the plant. You know, it varied. Neighbors opposed to each other on this thing. Ultimately, the governor refused to allow the plant to be built, rejected it. And there were 3 or 4 reasons, but one of the reasons was it was going to hurt the site of Olana. And Olana was such an important historic site, such a cultural contribution to New York's history, that to visit that site, to have to look out and see perhaps a smokestack across the river was something which was unacceptable to the governor. So that's actually probably even more recent. Just to our south, about an hour, a very different place from the places I've just shown, but I think really also a very beautiful place to visit is West Point, the U.S. Military Academy. West Point is a much more, has anyone been to West Point? Has been there? Oh, why not just move along then? It seemed like every hand just went. Are you all from Highland Falls? The West Point is, that's a terrible shot in terms of the color, obviously. It started again as a fort, turned in the early 19th century into the military academy. And just to give you a sense, too, because, moving through American history, we have just entered the 150th anniversary this year of the start of the U.S. Civil War. And the Hudson Valley was a major participant in that, sending thousands of troops off to fight. Stephen Crane, who wrote Red Badge of Courage, spent his summers, in fact, in the Hudson Valley with old recruits and getting his ideas down. He himself had not fought. But West Point, of course, was what produced all of the military leaders for those armies that fought in the 1860s. And the interesting thing about it is that about 70% of the commanders of the Union Army in 1860, before secession, before they broke into the North and South in 2 armies, 70% of them came from the South. It was a chivalrous route to follow to become an Army officer, and so 70% of the cadets, of the people graduating, even though the North was already twice the size of the South, were Southerners, which also explains why in the Civil War, why the South also did so well in the first several years. The commanders were overwhelmingly West Point educated, and many of the Northern commanders were as well, but many were not. Definitely would recommend this as well. Okay, and I'm going to close this off and bring this right up to date, which I can do, and then just open it for some questions. That probably should have been first, the half moon. That was my era, but history is cyclical. Everything comes full circle, and that may be our future again, the half moon. Which actually is a very evocative of, again, the way this area was settled. The Half Moon is a Dutch ship. It's a Dutch crew, and it was commanded by an English who could not communicate with his crew, and on the next voyage, of course, he was thrown off, and the mutiny, and he and his son died up around Canada because they couldn't. That's right. In 2009, and you know what? I had that picture of it, and I took that out. I'm sorry. In 2009, the 400th anniversary of the Hudson River Valley of this ship, the reconstructed Half Moon was out on our docks out there, and we warned the crowd beforehand as we're ending graduation that they were going to fire, and they fired their cannons. It was actually quite impressive. I think it's the only time in history they ever fired their cannon, actually, the Half Moon. I don't think they had anyone to fire at previous to that. This one, I just love to include this one because in 1909 was the 300th anniversary of the Hudson River Valley, and it was huge. There were big parades in New York City. There was the journey up the river of the Half Moon, and that's the Claremont, the Robert Fulton steamship, which was the first steamship in the United States. About 10 minutes into the trip up the Hudson outside of Manhattan, the Half Moon rammed the Claremont, and for the next 3 hours was stuck in there, and they had to pry it loose. And that's what you see there, essentially. Now, I need to update one last thing, and this is the walkway over the Hudson. And obviously, this was done before October of 2009 because there is a walkway over the Hudson now, not this kind of thing which has been put together. If you have the opportunity to do this tomorrow, if it's a nice day, just about a mile and a half to our south is the old Poughkeepsie Railroad Bridge, which was the largest railroad bridge, highest span in the United States, and built in the 1880s, 1890s. It was the only transportation route, of course, except up in Albany itself, to move trains from New England across the Hudson. It was used quite a bit during World War II as well. It burned in the 1970s. In 1974, there was a fire. The bridge itself, it's a massive structure, was sustained, but it was no longer used as a railroad line. And during 2008 and 2009, the speaker that we'll have tomorrow, Rob Dyson, spearheaded a major effort to have this turned into a walkway, which became not traditionally the highest spanned railroad, became the highest spanned walkway in the United States. You can walk across this, bike across it as well. I should have updated that with a new photo. Strangely enough, when I looked at it this afternoon, didn't even catch my eye that it wasn't real. Just kind of what that says, I don't know. The walkway. And what that kind of does show is a certain course here, not cyclical, but how this region and its culture has changed as well. Again, in the 17th, 18th century, very agricultural. The 19th century, it became much more industrial commerce developing in this region. The 20th century, it became a very technological region, obviously, one of the seeds of technological innovation in the United States and in the 20th into the 21st century. And again now, in 2011, the third or fourth major source of revenue to the Hudson Valley is tourism. It has become, again, a tourist attraction, usually 2 times of the year. Summer for many of the historic sites, fall for some of that beautiful autumnal foliage that you saw around Mohonk. And agritourism, in fact, is one of the main forms of tourism in this region. So that's just a kind of a quick snapshot of, and I think I came in under, I don't know where that, well, I hope where you took my watch and I don't know where it is either because it's not out here. A quick snapshot of Hudson Valley history and culture, and I hope you do have the opportunity either tomorrow or over the weekend or sometime in the future. To few of West Point's always worthwhile, but there are a few other places to see as well that have a rich history, and hope this will kind of enliven that. And I wish you a good rest of the conference as well. Thank you very much.